The House Judiciary Committee chamber fell silent as Justice Amy Coney Barrett's composed facade cracked, her voice rising with indignation. "You're attacking my faith. This is religious persecution." Her carefully maintained scholarly demeanor had completely vanished. But Jasmine Crockett remained perfectly calm, holding a stack of financial documents as she delivered the words that would shatter Barrett's judicial credibility. "You're not being persecuted for your faith, Justice Barrett. You're being questioned about using your power to persecute others through it." The gallery erupted as Barrett's mouth fell open, realizing her religious shield had just been torn away on national television. The confrontation that would expose the religious capture of America's highest court brought together two women representing opposite visions of justice. Amy Coney Barrett rushed onto the Supreme Court to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg in one of history's most cynical political maneuvers, embodied the intersection of religious fundamentalism and judicial power. Her originalist philosophy served as intellectual cover for imposing conservative Christian values through constitutional interpretation. Jasmine Crockett represented those whose rights Barrett had systematically stripped away: women denied reproductive health care, LGBTQ Americans facing discrimination, and citizens watching their secular democracy transformed into theocratic rule. A former civil rights attorney who understood both constitutional law and religious liberty, Crockett possessed the unique ability to expose how faith had become a weapon against freedom. The oversight hearing had been called following explosive revelations about Supreme Court justices receiving undisclosed gifts and coordinating with advocacy groups. Barrett arrived projecting her usual air of academic superiority, speaking in measured tones about judicial independence and the sanctity of the court. She deflected initial questions with practiced ease, using legal jargon to obscure rather than illuminate, maintaining the pretense that her decisions emerged from pure constitutional interpretation rather than religious doctrine. When asked about her connections to religious organizations, she offered vague platitudes about the compatibility of faith and jurisprudence. The tension erupted when Crockett began questioning Barrett about People of Praise, the secretive religious group where women were called handmaids and submitted to male authority. Barrett immediately bristled, interrupting Crockett mid-question with uncharacteristic sharpness. "Representative Crockett, you clearly don't understand the separation between personal faith and judicial duty. Your line of questioning attacks religious liberty itself. This is precisely the kind of anti-Catholic bigotry that has no place in our democracy." Her voice carried the righteousness of someone accustomed to using faith as both sword and shield, expecting deference to her religious authority. But Crockett had done extensive preparation. She calmly pulled out financial records showing Barrett had received $400,000 in previously undisclosed speaking fees from the Alliance Defending Freedom, paid through a series of shell organizations to avoid detection. These payments occurred just months before Barrett ruled in the Alliance's favor in a major religious liberty case. The committee room stirred as Crockett presented bank records showing transfers from religious organizations to accounts controlled by Barrett's husband, technically avoiding disclosure requirements while clearly constituting payment for influence. Crockett continued methodically through Barrett's financial entanglements with religious groups that had cases before the court. The Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty had paid for multiple retreats worth tens of thousands of dollars where Barrett was the only judicial attendee. The Catholic League had funded research assistance for Barrett totaling $200,000, despite her having a full complement of Supreme Court clerks. Each revelation painted a picture of a justice whose religious affiliations weren't just personal faith, but financial relationships with organizations using the court to impose their beliefs on all Americans. The room grew increasingly tense as Crockett presented internal emails from People of Praise leadership discussing strategies to influence Barrett's jurisprudence. One email explicitly stated, "Our sister Amy understands her role in restoring God's kingdom through judicial authority." Another discussed how to frame religious liberty arguments to appeal to Barrett's formation in the community. The most damaging email came from a People of Praise elder celebrating the overturning of Roe v. Wade as Amy fulfilling her covenant with the community to protect God's plan for life. Barrett's composure began fracturing as she attempted to dismiss the emails as misunderstandings, but Crockett had more evidence. She presented recordings from religious liberty conferences where Barrett, while a sitting justice, had participated in strategy sessions about pending cases. In one recording, Barrett could be heard advising religious lawyers on how to frame their arguments to win her vote, essentially coaching litigants while their cases were active. The violation of judicial ethics was so blatant that even Republican committee members looked uncomfortable. The first major twist came when Crockett revealed Barrett's own academic writings from before her appointment. She read extensively from law review articles where Barrett had argued that Catholic judges faced an inherent conflict between their faith and their judicial duties. "Let me quote your own words, Justice Barrett," Crockett said, reading from a highlighted passage. "Catholic judges cannot in good conscience enforce laws that contradict church teaching without formal cooperation with evil. In such cases, recusal is not just preferable but morally mandatory." She looked up at Barrett, whose face had gone pale. "You wrote that Catholic judges must recuse themselves when faith conflicts with law. Yet you've never recused yourself, despite obvious conflicts. Why?" Barrett attempted to argue that her views had evolved, that she had found ways to reconcile faith and law, but Crockett pressed forward with more of Barrett's own writings. Articles where she explicitly stated that life begins at conception and abortion is murder. Papers arguing that homosexuality violates natural law. Essays claiming that secular law must yield to religious conscience. Each quote demonstrated that Barrett's judicial philosophy wasn't originalism, but religious dogma dressed in constitutional language. The devastating climax began when Crockett connected Barrett's financial relationships to her judicial decisions. Every organization that had paid Barrett had won their cases before her. Every religious liberty claim had been upheld. Every challenge to reproductive rights had succeeded. Every LGBTQ protection had been struck down. The pattern was undeniable. Barrett's votes could be predicted by checking which religious groups had funded her. "Justice Barrett, you haven't been interpreting the Constitution," Crockett said, her voice carrying across the silent chamber. "You've been delivering purchased opinions to your religious benefactors." Crockett then presented the most damaging evidence, documentation showing that Barrett's confirmation had been orchestrated by dark money groups that explicitly stated their goal was to place a godly woman on the court to restore Christian values to America. Over $2 million had been spent on advertisements and lobbying, funded by religious organizations that would later have cases before Barrett. She had known about this support, had coordinated with these groups, and had made commitments about her future rulings in exchange for their backing. Barrett, now visibly shaken and abandoning her practiced composure, stood and accused Crockett of religious bigotry. Her voice cracked with emotion as she claimed she was being persecuted for her Catholic faith, that this was an inquisition designed to drive believers from public life. She invoked martyrdom, comparing herself to Thomas More, suggesting that Crockett's questions were an attack on all people of faith. Her defensive fury revealed someone who had never expected to be challenged, who believed her position and faith placed her above accountability. Crockett waited for Barrett to finish, then delivered her response with devastating clarity. "Justice Barrett, you're not being persecuted for your faith. You're being questioned about using your power to persecute others through it. You took an oath to the Constitution, not the Vatican. You swore to uphold the law, not Catholic doctrine. Every woman forced to carry her rapist's child, every gay couple denied equal rights, every secular American forced to live under religious rules, they're the ones being persecuted. By you, through your votes, using your faith as a weapon." She continued while Barrett stood frozen, unable to formulate a response. "You want credit for your devotion while denying others their freedom. You wrap your prejudices in prayer and call it principle. You've turned the Supreme Court into a subsidiary of the Catholic Church while claiming to be an originalist. The Founding Fathers explicitly rejected religious tests for office, yet you've imposed one through your jurisprudence. When you strip rights from women while accepting money from groups celebrating that outcome, that's not faith, it's corruption wearing a cross." The committee room exploded in chaos. Progressive activists in the gallery erupted in applause while religious conservatives shouted in protest. Barrett attempted to respond, but her words came out jumbled, incoherent, shifting between Latin legal phrases and Catholic theology in a desperate attempt to maintain authority. She finally gave up, gathering her materials with shaking hands and walking out of the hearing while still wearing her microphone, her muttered prayers being broadcast to the entire nation. The image of a Supreme Court justice fleeing while praying became the defining visual of religious extremism's exposure at the highest levels of American law. Within hours, #BarrettExposed and #CorruptionWearingACross trended globally. Legal scholars called for immediate investigations into Barrett's financial relationships with religious organizations. The dark money revelations triggered demands for her recusal from all pending religious liberty cases. Even conservative legal commentators struggled to defend the obvious ethical violations, with several prominent Catholic lawyers publicly stating that Barrett had damaged both the court and the faith through her corruption. The aftermath was severe and immediate. Multiple judicial ethics complaints were filed against Barrett. The House Judiciary Committee voted to subpoena all financial records related to her religious affiliations. Women's rights groups filed motions demanding her recusal from abortion cases based on the evidence of financial conflicts. The Catholic Church itself distanced from Barrett, with several bishops stating she had confused personal interpretation with church doctrine. Law schools began teaching the confrontation as a case study in judicial corruption and the dangers of theocratic capture of democratic institutions.